Greetings everyone. My name is Lisa. I'm here with the Saskatoon Compost Coaches, and I am delighted today to be giving a little demo to do with composting. So first I'm going to talk just a little bit about the background of composting. Why would we take the time to do it? Then I'm going to talk about options that are available in Saskatoon or cities like Saskatoon. And finally, we're going to go over the basic no-fail recipe for composting at home, either in a bin or in a couple alternate methods, such as a vermicompost bin or a Bokashi bucket, which I've got under there. So, just to start off with a little bit of background, most people have sort of a general idea that composting is good for the planet somehow, but if you get into the specifics, they're kind of drawing a blank, which is fine. So there's three big things that we talk about. The first one is pretty straightforward, and it's just that if we are taking all of our food waste and our yard waste, stuff like grass and leaves and branches, and we're putting it into the compost instead of into the garbage, then we just end up with a lot less garbage at the end of the day. And that's good for us because our bins aren't so heavy and stinky, but also it's good for cities and towns and anywhere that has to manage either a landfill or a waste transfer station, because it turns out dealing with garbage is just really expensive, and it takes a lot of resources and a lot of infrastructure. So basically, the more you can cut down on the waste stream coming from a community, the more money is free to do other things like repair roads and do community programs. So we like to save money in that way. The second big thing that it's for has to do with avoiding methane pollution coming from the landfill. And what that's about is that it actually turns out that stuff like this, like food waste and yard waste, rots differently under different circumstances. And specifically, if you put it in a circumstance where it doesn't have very much air, like say a landfill, where it's all packed down really tight and covered up with more stuff, then it doesn't rot very well. It rots very slowly. It can take years or even decades for materials in a landfill to break down. And in the meantime, unfortunately, it makes a lot of nasty byproducts that we're not super fond of. Things like methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas, and ammonia, and a few other things, hydrogen sulfide, none of which are super great for the environment or our communities. So we don't really like having those things being formed at the landfill. But if we take this stuff, our food waste, our yard waste, and we put it in a compost system instead, compost systems are always managed so they have some air available. And when you have that air available, you can get stuff to break down very quickly and cleanly without all of those byproducts. So that's the second reason, and that's just to do with avoiding pollution. The third one, of course, is for all of the gardeners and farmers and other agriculturalists out here, is that finished compost, the soil-like material we get at the end of the process, is absolute gold for growing food, growing flowers, growing trees, anything that you're trying to grow, because it has a few things going for it. Finished compost has a really good, really complete blend of nutrients for the plants to eat, including the big macronutrients, but also little ones too, like sulfur and silicone. It also really helps the texture of soil. So when we're adding finished compost to soil, it becomes a lot more nice and loose and loamy, easier to dig in. And the last thing is that compost also improves how soil deals with water. Basically, it helps it to infiltrate the soil better, and it also helps the soil to hang on to it better. It's like a sponge in the soil. So when we add some of that nice, fluffy organic matter in the form of finished compost, when we get a big rain, the water goes into the soil more easily, and so we get less ponding and flooding. And then in between rains, it hangs on to the water better. So our plants don't dry out as quickly, and we don't need to water as often. So these are the big reasons that we really like to compost. It's great for the garden, it's great for the farm, it helps the municipalities with saving a little bit of money on their garbage bill. And the final thing is that it helps prevent pollution at the landfill. So that's all of the actual background of why we want to do it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about options, and then I get to play with all of my props here. So for Saskatoon, the big options are, you can either go to one of our two compost depots. We've got one on the east side, we've got one on the west side. They are open from May until November, and basically you can drop off all of your yard waste like leaves and grass and trees, although watch out for elmwood, that one will get you in trouble. And they will take it for free, and they even, at the West Side Depot, have a little pile of finished compost and of just plain old wood mulch that you can take some home for free. So that's really excellent, just a nice drop-off service. We also, some people might be familiar with our green cart system, which is it is a opt-in subscription system, so you would pay the city just a little bit of money. I think if you register before the end of April, it's $65 for a year. After that, it's $85. And then for that whole year, they'll bring you a green cart in addition to your blue cart and your black cart. And the green cart will be for all of your food waste and yard waste. It'll get picked up by the city. It'll get made into compost. Currently, the green cart is only available to folks living in like single unit houses and not to apartments or other group living situations. But there is a proposed expansion in 2023 where we might see it become available to the rest of the citizens of Saskatoon as well. So these are our institutional options. The third option, which is my favorite personally, is that we can always compost at home. Even if we don't have an outdoor space, composting is dead simple, and there is lots of different ways to do it and different methods, and pretty much all of them work quite easily and with very few problems. The only real difference between an expert composter and a beginner composter is how quickly they're getting the finished product, but as long as you have a little patience, it actually really doesn't matter what skill level you have. So now I'm going to show a little bit about how to compost at home. So this is probably what most people are familiar with, which is to say a compost bin. It's the most common way people tend to make compost at home, although there's tons of other ways, as I've said. This one that I've got here is a store-bought model. You might recognize the kind of black plastic aesthetic that it has going for it, but you can always make your own bin. You can make them out of lumber, you can make them out of wire, you can make them out of cinder blocks. Any kind of non-toxic material is totally fine for a compost enclosure. There's nothing super special or magic about a compost bin. It really just is a nice sturdy container for keeping everything neat and tidy and keeping animals off it while it breaks down. So it's not really doing anything incredibly complicated. You just need a nice container for it. For this one is called a soil saver, and I like it for its shape and its volume. It works well for me as a small household of 2 or 3 people. So once we have a compost bin, how do we decide where to put it in our yard? There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that it is going to have just a little bit of compost juice runoff, so it's good to have it on some kind of a permeable surface, like dirt or grass or mulch, where the liquid is going to just be able to sink into the ground. The second thing, though, is that we want to have it somewhere that it's really convenient for us to get to it, so that when we're taking our little container of kitchen scraps out, it's not a huge hike to reach the compost bin. In terms of sun or shade, which is a question we get a lot, the answer is actually it doesn't matter that much. Compost can be made in the sun, compost can be made in the shade. It mostly just affects how quickly it thaws out in the spring. But other than that, it works out about the same. What we often say is if you've only got a little bit of nice sunny space in your yard, grow plants there. Put your compost somewhere that's not ideal for gardening. So we've put our bin down in our yard. Now we're going to use it. This is the part that I like explaining the most. There is a 5-step, just very simple recipe for making compost that always works. So the 5 steps are green material, which I will talk about, brown material, I'll also talk about that, and then the nice simple ones, some water, some air, and some soil. Green materials are a little sparse on the ground right now, as it is still March and we haven't started growing yet, but I did bring some food waste to show. So what green material is it's all of our fresh stuff. Chemically, it's higher in nitrogen, and you can think of it like the fuel that really gets the compost going. Without it, the compost breaks down very slowly. But at the same time, if we get out of balance and we have only green material, then our compost can get kind of wet and dense and smelly. So we're looking for a nice balance of green and brown material. Green material, as I said, is the fresh stuff, which includes green grass clippings, green plants, any kind of garden weeds and stuff. And then it also includes basically all of our food waste that we might be putting in. Technically, if we really wanted to get picky and get into our food waste, we could say, well, actually, this nutshell is a brown material. But on average, food waste is very high in nitrogen, so we just lump it all together. So I've got my little kitchen container here, and say I might have this under the sink or next to it or on my counter all day. And it doesn't have to be a nice fancy one like this, made of metal. A lot of times people just use a bowl or an ice cream pail. And what kinds of stuff would I be putting in during the day as I cook? Well, I've got this lovely plate of examples. The first thing to say is basically anything that comes from a vegetable or a fruit is good to go in. That's all of the predictable things, like you can put in a banana peel, you can put in an apple core, some melon rind, the base of some celery, all of this kinds of things can go in. And it actually doesn't matter whether it's cooked or not. If you've got some cooked vegetables that got too old or there's something else wrong with them, that's fine for it to go in, doesn't make any difference. And in fact, one thing that people often don't know about is you can absolutely put in citrus. You've got your citrus rinds from a lemon or an orange or even just a whole orange that's gone squashy. There's no problem with that. Citrus can go right in the compost. If we're making some coffee or tea in the morning to wake up, we might end up with a little filter full of beans or a little bag full of leaves, and in either case, these can go straight in. One word of caution, some brands of tea bag seem to be made out of plastic rather than paper. So if you're not sure, just take your tea bag for a second and see if you can tear it. And if it tears, it's definitely paper and it's good to go in. If it's one of the plastic ones, you could still put it in, but you'll be fishing the little plastic piece out of the compost when you're finished. One thing a lot of people don't know is that you can actually put in materials that are made out of seeds or flour as well. This counts as plant-based enough that it's fine to be composted. So that's things like moldy bread or bread crusts if you've got a picky child, or things like cereal or pasta, any kind of just sort of starch that's left over and not good to eat anymore can go in the compost as well. Now, everything we've done so far has been plant-based. We've had vegetables, we've had fruits, we've had coffee beans, we've had things made with flour. There was one item made from animal products that is also really excellent for our compost, and that is our little eggshells. So if you're making yourself a delicious omelet in the morning, you can hang on to the shells and put them in your compost. Honestly, some gardeners keep their shells aside and put them straight into the garden, and that is fine too. I usually throw mine in the compost just to keep things simple. So I'll just get the rest of my food waste here. I've got an avocado with a pit. I've got the pit from a peach, top of a pepper, a few more citrus rinds, a little bit of onions and carrots, and some nutshells that I held up earlier. So all of that is going to go straight in there. But I also have some negative examples. These are the types of things that I would want to keep out of my compost bin. And the reason isn't that they won't rot. Eventually, they would, but it takes a little bit longer, and while any of these things are breaking down, they can have a pretty powerful bad smell that we're not really fond of. It's both annoying to humans and quite attractive to animals, so anything from a little mouse to a big old coyote might be interested in these kinds of smells in your compost bin. So what have I got here? I've got some things that are more protein and grease-based and more animal-based. I have some plain old chicken bones. I would not be putting these into my compost. At the same time, if half a chicken bone ends up in your compost, it's not the end of the world, but don't be adding them regularly. I've got the actual inside of an egg here, so the shell is fine, the egg, not so great. A little bit of greasy cooked food. This has got some cheese, it's got some oil, it's got enough animal-based grease on it that I would not put it in, even though it does have a kind of a bready base. And similarly here, I've got a nice tuna salad sandwich where while the bread would be okay to go in, the big lump of tuna in the middle, a bit too much protein and grease, so I'm leaving that out. Things can fall in a gray area sometimes, so the thing to keep in mind is that little traces of animal materials or grease in your compost bin isn't the biggest deal, but if it's a lot of it, it can cause some issues. All right, so now we have our green materials in here. You may notice that mine is lined with some newspaper. I do that because it means when I dump out my materials, it all comes out cleanly. You don't actually have to line your bin, but if you are going to, I do recommend using something paper-based. There are green compostable plastic bags that are sold as liners as well. Unfortunately, they don't break down very well in a home compost. They do much better in a big industrial one. So if you use the little bags, you might end up with little bag shreds in your finished compost, which can be a big pain. If you don't have newspaper, paper towel, the paper bag for takeout, any kind of paper will do. So I'll put this aside. In our 5-step recipe, if you remember that, our 5-step recipe had green materials, brown materials, water, soil, and air. Our green materials should be about half of what's in our compost bin. Half is enough fuel to get the compost going, help it breaking down quickly, but it leaves enough space for other things to balance it out and prevent bad smells. So now I'm going to talk about brown materials, which are things that are more carbon-based and woody. My easiest one, my go-to in Saskatoon, city of trees, is leaves. So what I do in the fall is I go onto the internet and I find people who are giving away bags of leaves, and then I just hoard up 10 or 20 bags for myself, like some sort of slightly confused squirrel in the fall. And I put them in the corner of my yard and just use them the next year, both for compost and for mulch. But if you don't have leaves, or if you're starting the wrong time of year for leaves, there's lots of other things that can work. You can use wood chips, you can use sawdust, you can use straw, or something that we tend to have at home. You can use any kind of scrap paper. I have a newspaper subscription, but not many people do these days. Flyers work fine. Even white office paper can be okay. The only kind of paper you really want to avoid is those shiny magazine pages. And then, of course, soiled things like a restaurant napkin or a muffin liner, or even little bits of wood, like if you're eating popsicles with your children, or bits of cardboard from the washroom. So those kinds of things can all be used as brown materials as well. And we want that to be the other half of what's going into our compost bin. So I'm just going to take a minute and put our ingredients into our bin. Doesn't matter if you start with green material or brown material, as long as you remember to balance the two. So I'm going to start with my little bucket of green material, food waste. Dump the whole thing out there. And then I'd want to put a roughly equivalent amount of leaves on top. This is not an exact science, so don't worry too much about it. That'll do. After we've got our brown materials and green materials taken care of, the last 3 ingredients are easier to remember. It's just water, air, and soil. So speaking of water, this is the most important factor in actually getting your compost to break down in Saskatchewan in our weather. And it's the one that most people, when they're having trouble with their compost, this is usually what's missing. Compost needs to be damp or it doesn't break down at all. And so when things get all dried out in the summer, if we're not adding water to our compost, we're just going to end up with some mummified plants and nothing else. So I like to add water to my compost about every 2 weeks during the summer, even if it rains, honestly. If you don't have a lid, some rain will go into your compost bin, but usually not enough to keep it wet all the way through. So you want to just come in with a watering can or a hose and just put it on low and just stand there watering for a couple of minutes every 2 weeks. I'm on stage, so I'm only going to give it about that much water, but normally I would just stand here and listen to the birds chirp and just water for a few minutes every couple of weeks. If you can't do it every couple of weeks, every month, every 2 months, even once a season is better than not doing it at all. It's not like garden plants where you run the risk of having them wilt and die if they're thirsty for too long. Compost just goes to sleep when it's dry and it will come back to life as soon as we water it. So, green material, brown material, water. Now we are going to talk about air. This is what makes the difference between compost in a compost bin and the wrong kind of pollution-filled rotting at a landfill. In a compost bin, the edges will always get lots of air through the vents and the gaps, as you can see there. Both big tumbling compost bins and compost bins that sit on the ground like this tend to have a few vents for the air to get in. But we might be worried about what the middle of the pile is doing, where it's far away from all of the vents. And if we are worried about that, there's a couple things we can do. One very simple trick is to make an aeration pipe, which is a very fancy word for a pipe with holes in it. So this is just a plastic pipe from a hardware store. It probably cost a few cents to get this. And we put some holes into it with a drill, and then we would simply place it in the center of our compost bin. and build our compost pile around it. And it will act like a straw for the air to get into the center of the pile. And that can work very, very well. One step up from that in terms of both amount of aeration but also amount of work is that we can come in with a tool and stir it up again, I like to do every couple of weeks, but once again, every month, every 2 months, once a season. Doing it at all is better than never doing it. And so this one right here is actually a compost aerator. It's a tool specifically made for stirring compost in this type of a bin, in that it can plunge down quite easily. It's quite pointy on the bottom, but then when you pull it out again, these wings pop out and it stirs everything up. So it's really nice for stirring compost bins that open from the top. If you have a big old stall compost bin made out of, say, 4 pallets or some cinder blocks and you're stirring it from the front, then you can always just use something like a garden fork, a potato fork, a shovel. But I can tell you, when you're stirring this kind of compost that opens from the top, when you try to get one of these in there, it gets only about that far and then gets stuck and you get really frustrated and it's very difficult to turn. So I really like shelling out just a little bit of extra money to get one of these. Adding air like that will both keep it breaking down quickly and will also prevent it from forming bad smells, which are another thing that happens when it's running out of oxygen. So we've got some air, we've got some water, some green and brown materials. The last step that we mentioned is just soil. This step is actually optional. However, it does help. It gives things a boost. Soil is full of decomposition microbes, tons of beneficial bacteria, tons of beneficial fungus, and when we're putting that into our compost, we're basically giving it a boost. It's like putting in some yeast into our bread dough. So I'm going to pull out this here. Now I say soil, and by that I mean just a chunk of dirt from the ground. We're not looking for potting soil or anything like that because it tends to be sterile on purpose. So we're looking from just dirt from the ground or compost, previously finished compost. What I've got here is some previously finished compost from the city's compost depot. And so not every 2 weeks, honestly only every month or couple of months, I would come along and just add half a scoop of a little bit of soil. So I'm just gonna put a little in right now. And that's all I do. It's not a lot, it's just a trace, but again, it's just to give it a little bit of good microbes. It also helps it to stay damp because it holds water, and it's another thing that can help prevent any kind of odor coming out of the compost bin. So if we follow this whole recipe, half browns, half greens, little water, little air, little soil, we should have compost that breaks down completely in as little as 6 weeks, but more commonly, somewhere between 2 and 4 or 5 months. The reason I give such a big range on that is it really does depend on how often it's watered, how often it's stirred, what did you start with. But you can totally get compost at least once a season, twice if you're working on it. Most people will get into a rhythm where they harvest their compost maybe every spring or maybe every fall, because that lets them get the compost on the garden either before the plants go in or after the plants are finished, which can be simpler than sprinkling around the plants. Although you can do it anytime if you don't mind sprinkling around your plants. When it's time to harvest, you would come up to your bin. These types have a door on the front which can be lifted up so that you can get in there with a shovel or a trowel, try to take stuff out, or you can lift up the whole bin and just pull it off of the pile, which gives you a better picture of what's inside of it. In this style of bin, it won't all be finished at once. It'll have kind of a layer cake going on where the finished compost is at the bottom, and then the half-finished compost is in the middle, and the fresh material is at the top. So you will just be digging out the finished stuff from the bottom and not taking the whole bin at the end of the season. With a tumbling compost bin, the ones that rotate like a barrel, they are really interesting in that they're really fun to use. We haven't found them faster or slower than this style of bin, to be honest, but they're fun to use. They work best if you do it in batches. So because they're always mixing the new material and the old material together, it's hard to get fully finished compost out of a tumbling compost bin unless you have two and you only use one and then only use the other, or you have a tumbling compost bin and one static bin, or some kind of a batch system. How do you recognize finished compost? Well, there's a few things. Let's see if I can put a little compost on a plate for us here to focus on. Compost is crumbly and brown, somewhere between brown and black. and it smells earthy. That's a very important one. It should smell like soil after a rain. It should not smell sour or manure-like at all. That would mean that it is not done, and B, might need a little stir for more oxygen. It isn't completely uniform. When we see compost from a store, it's almost always been put through some kind of a fine screen, which takes out all of the chunks and all of the lumps, and when we get left at the end is very fine, almost like peat moss. This one actually is quite fine. This is a sample from the city's industrial compost site, which composts a little harder and a little more thoroughly than a home compost bin. But normally, if we were using compost from home, we would expect it to be brown and crumbly and smell like soil, but you would still see a few little chunks in it. What kind of stuff? Well, you'd see an eggshell, you'd see a peach pit, that peach pit from before, you'd see a little bit of a stick or a wood chip, maybe a little piece of avocado skin. Basically anything that's a little tougher and woodier might still be present and visible, but half broken down in the finished compost. However, all of the softer stuff, your apple cores, your banana skins, your green plants, should be completely gone. You shouldn't see them at all. If you want your compost to look lovely and fine, like compost from the store or compost from an industrial site, you can just get a piece of metal mesh with 1-inch or half-inch holes and just throw it on top of a wheelbarrow or a large tub, put the compost through it, it'll take all of the chunks out, and you'll have a really fine mix at the end. To be clear, your plants do not care either way. It is just for looks, but sometimes looks are important. Not usually, though. So that's how to recognize our finished compost. In terms of using it, we would just want to get it back in contact with the soil. Any way that gets it back in contact with the soil is pretty much foolproof. So you can put it on top of the ground. You can stir it in. You don't have to. If you're using mulch, you'd probably scrape the mulch back, put on the compost, and then put the mulch back on top of it. You can mix it with soil for a potting mix. You can throw it into planting holes when you're doing trees. If you have a nice fine mix, you can even rake about 1 centimeter of it out onto your lawn once a year, and it'll make your lawn very lush and very green and not need watering as much. So these are sort of the ways that we might use it at the end. Now, I'm just going to take a minute, take a step back. We've been talking about bins this whole time. I want to talk a little bit about other methods. One very simple one, which is another one for outside. It's called trench composting. And that one is really just digging a hole, if you have a garden space, putting your food waste into it, or your other plants and brown waste as well, and covering it up with 6 to 8 inches of soil. And that's really it. You don't need to water it or stir it or even worry too much about balancing it. Trench composting is sort of just mimicking patterns of nature and letting all of the little soil microbes and earthworms tear stuff apart for you. So it's a very, very simple way to do it. You do need the space though, and it does not work great in winter when everything is frozen solid. So that's trench composting. Another one that we've got here is vermicomposting. This is our first method for inside that I'm going to talk about. So vermicomposting is done in a small container, typically. This is a homemade one. It's made out of a Rubbermaid container. It's got holes in the lid for lots of airflow. But there are some ready-made vermicompost bins you can get from the store as well. They have stacking tiers, and they're quite nice. Anything, again, that's non-toxic and just a little bit flexible works well. I say flexible because you don't want to bang this into something in your house and crack it by accident. If it's a little bendy, then that's less of a risk. Inside of the bin, you'll have, well, maybe a spoon for stirring. Up to you. But you'll have some paper bedding. Shredded paper is the most common. Cardboard can work as well. Sometimes people will use straw or leaves, but something that mimics brown materials is going to be the top layer of the bin. And underneath that, you will do two things. You will tuck food waste underneath the paper, and you will also have our special helpers, red Wiggler Earthworms. Yes, I said live red Wiggler Earthworms. They live in the vermicompost bin. They eat all the materials, and they turn it into worm castings. They are also very, very polite house guests. They stay in the bin. They have no interest in leaving. It's nice and damp in here. It's got food. It's quiet. It's wet. It's their favorite place. They don't want to come out. And they are also very quiet and very industrious. So anybody who's really squeamish about earthworms, now is the time to look away, but there's tons of these little guys in here, and they are just doing their work, living their lives, and making me a whole lot of really excellent dark compost. So this vermicompost can sometimes be sold in little tiny bags in the gardening store for 20 bucks a pop because it is gold when you are gardening. So this is a great one to do indoors, works in an apartment, works in a classroom, works in an office building. If you've got more questions about that, feel free to contact the Saskatoon Compost Coaches. We'd love to give you more details. Now the last one I'm going to mention is a bit of an odd duck. It is called Bokashi Composting, and it is usually done in some kind of a bucket like this. So Bokashi composting, oh, very strange. It is a two-step process. The first step involves fermenting food waste in a sealed container. Very weird. And then the second step is composting it like normal in a bin or in a trench compost. And so why would people go to all the fuss and bother of doing Bokashi? There's two things. One, it can be convenient that the first step is done inside in a bucket. Again, if you're in an apartment or somewhere without an outdoor space, you could be Bokashi composting and just storing it up in a couple of buckets. And then a couple times a year, you visit your local community garden and empty it out or something like that. And the other awesome thing about Bokashi is that in addition to all of your regular plant-based food waste, you are actually allowed to put all of your meat and bones and greasy stuff in a Bokashi compost. It is the only one for home composting that can manage all of this pizza and chicken and eggs, and so it can be really nice for that. I do actually keep one of these going at home in addition to my compost bin, and after I've boiled a bunch of bones for broth, they go straight in here. So those are the methods I want to talk about today. If anybody has more questions about Bokashi, about vermicompost, about bin composting, any kind of home composting questions, please reach out to the Saskatoon Compost Coaches. We're always happy to help. Our services are free. We can do consultations by phone or email, and we can even do socially distanced home visits these days once it warms up a little bit outside. And we would love to talk to you. So I hope I've inspired a few folks to think about composting. I'm certainly inspired to think about gardening this time of year. And until the snow completely melts, I look forward to spring. Thanks.